went on to say that the witnesses, the evidence that had been provided in his court showed him unequivocally that this was genocide, a finding by a US judge. So that was a very important component. It's also the case that in both the hinted at in the initial preliminary ruling by the International Court of Justice on the genocide case, and the full ruling of the court, the International Court of Justice, on an earlier case that had been brought 3 years ago by the General Assembly of the United Nations, that asked the court for an advisory opinion on the legality or illegality of the entire Israeli occupation project, what we call genocide and what we call apartheid. And the court issued an extraordinary report. It took almost 3 years, 2.5 years, but that report said that the entire project of Israeli settlement was illegal, that all the settlers were illegal, and that they all should be evacuated within 1 year, by the end of this year. It went on to say that every government who is a member of the United Nations General Assembly and a signatory to the International Court of Justice as a result is obligated to abide by a set of rules based on that ruling that they had issued, but knowing that they do not have the capacity for enforcement. They don't have an army, they don't have a police force, they don't even have a process server. The enforcement comes back to us, to civil society. And the model here is, what the court said is it goes back to the United Nations. The United Nations has to enforce this. So it goes first to the Security Council, where, of course, as usual, the US vetoes it. But then it goes to the General Assembly, where there's no veto. And they passed this amazing resolution based on the court's decision that all of the occupation is illegal, that all the settlers must be evacuated, that no country should be selling arms to Israel or buying arms from Israel, that there should be an economic boycott. It goes on, really beyond what the BDS movement, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement, has called for.
Isn't Yemen doing what the ICJ
one can certainly argue, yes, one can certainly argue that as the top human rights official of the United Nations, formerly in New York, Craig Mochaiber, recently wrote in Mondoweiss that it is only Yemen that is overtly doing what the court calls for in preventing arms from going to Israel, preventing the sales, preventing the money. I think that is the argument. That is absolutely the argument. But it's also important that there is a role for us to play in this as civil society. And the model we have to look at, again, comes back to South Africa. Because if you remember in the 1980s, in the anti-apartheid movement, there were efforts all over the country, all over the world, to impose sanctions on South Africa. And finally, the UN General Assembly called for sanctions, and so country after country, government after government, started implementing that. It wasn't because the Assembly could force them to, but because they were told, there were mobilizations, protests in their streets, saying, we demand our government abide by what the General Assembly said. And the Assembly said, sanctions on South Africa to stop apartheid. And eventually, enough of them did that the US was under such pressure that Congress finally passed a sanctions resolution. And when Ronald Reagan vetoed it, they were able to get the votes to overturn the veto, and finally the US imposed sanctions. That's the model for us today. Governments around the world are starting to impose sanctions on Israel already for its violations of international law, for its violations of the Apartheid Convention, its violations of the Genocide Convention. And now it's up to us to follow that and say that's going to be the basis of pressure on our country as well. That's what will stop it. The point you started with, Michel, is so key about what Israel understood about US support. And if you remember what happened during the early months of the genocide, and then continued, when you had the president of this country and the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense all saying things like, please don't kill so many Palestinians. This has really gone too far. This is a red line. all kinds of things like that. But they continue to send the weapons. So why should Netanyahu believe them? Why should he care what they say? Because actions speak louder than words. And when you are the president of the most powerful country in the world with the most powerful military that ever existed in history, and you are giving to this other country everything they want, why do we think they should care about what they say in the meantime? I'm heartbroken. Well, he probably was heartbroken. He's a kind of emotional guy, President Biden. But frankly, what difference does it make if he's heartbroken or not? The day that the humanitarian workers from World Central Kitchen were killed, 7 in a targeted attack on their cars, their marked cars, arranged with the Israeli military, who knew they would be going through that area. 7 people, 6 of them were internationals. Maybe that was why President Biden was particularly heartbroken that day, but let's put that aside. He said he was heartbroken. He probably was. Most people in the world were. It was a horror show. 8 hours later, he signed the approval to send another $8 billion worth of weapons. So really, what does it matter whether he's heartbroken or not? And why should Netanyahu care?
You know, Gaza has been used as a laboratory for testing Israeli weapons, surveillance equipment, AI technology, drones and robotics and so on and so forth. And as a result of this experimentation, the largest number of people killed, maimed, injured, burned alive, as you just said, or remain under the rubble are children. Does this count as self-defense? As targeting Hamas terrorists, as our government and the mainstream media want us to believe? Or are they all receiving the same talking points from their Israeli handlers?
Not only are the U.S. officials receiving their talking points from, I don't know if it's only their Israeli handlers, it's their own people and their own beliefs. We should not forget that President Biden has said over and over again that he is a Zionist. He says, I am a Zionist, and he goes back over and over and over again to his meeting in 1974 with Golda Meir when he told her that he would protect precious little Israel. 3 people that I talked to in and around Congress who had talked with Biden about this said when he talks about it, he puts his hands like this, holding precious little Israel, which maybe he thought it was back then, but no one who now knows of Israel's military capacity because of our support, we pay, of course, 40% of the entire Israeli military budget, the Israeli nuclear arsenal can believe that it is somehow a precious little jewel that has to be protected from outside. The Prime Minister of Israel and others have said there are no civilians. They include children within that. And then they blame Hamas because they're not able to protect those children from being killed by those bombs. The other thing we have to remember here, this is not just a normal war with more than usual casualties. This is an Israeli assault on a country, a territory, a land, and a people that it occupies. And international law is very, very clear that while a country has the right of self-defense against being attacked by another country, a country is being, in its view, attacked by people coming from a territory that it occupies, does not have the right to military attack on the country it occupies. Indeed, an occupied population living under military occupation has the right of self-defense, including the right of armed resistance to that occupation. Now, that right is not unlimited. That right does not include the right to attack civilians. So, for example, in the attack of October 7th, in the attack on southern Israel, the attacks that were first launched were on military targets, 2 different military bases, a number of checkpoints. Those attacks by Palestinians who had spent the last 17 years living under an enclosure, a prison, and had spent the last 55 years under military occupation, had the right to military resistance. The attacks that followed, some not by Hamas at all, the attacks that followed against civilians clearly were violations of international law. But the initial attacks on military targets were not. And the prohibition against an occupying power militarily assaulting the country, the territory that they occupy, is an absolute. So, yeah, there's no justification here for these attacks. They are known to be attacking areas where there are families and children. They have a name for it, and it's escaping me at the moment. They call it the, help me out here, it's something like the daddy policy. It's something as, you know what I'm talking about. Daddy's home, thank you. The daddy's home policy. For those of you who don't know what it means this is the strategic military decision when they have identified somebody that they believe, for whatever reason, whether it's true or not, that they believe to be a Hamas militant or somebody who once said they like Hamas or whatever it is, they choose to attack in their home when they know the family will be there as well and will be targeted as well. Daddy's home.
Yeah. I mean, we've seen some horrific video footage and reports that have emerged of Israeli soldiers executing 15 paramedics over this past week. In addition, the UN has reported discovery of mass graves around the hospitals, and a number of hospitals containing the bodies of those executed Palestinians. I was really surprised to see that for the first time in mainstream media, like the New York Times, CNN, the BBC, reported on that story. Are we perhaps seeing a shift in the reporting, or is this a one-off thing?
I think we have to be careful here. I don't think this was the first time. It's not the norm, for sure. But there have been reports that have been important by the New York Times, by the BBC. This was a joint BBC-New York Times one. And it's not to say that they're doing a good job. They're not. The press still kind of sucks. But it is night and day different than what it was before the genocide began, what it was, say, 5 years ago, what it was 20 years ago. You and I were both co-founders of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights in 2001. Remember that? Remember those meetings? And we talked about the press then. The idea at that time, if somebody had told us that the word Nakba would be on the front page of the New York Times, ever, that the Washington Post would have Palestinian voices on the opinion page, we would have said, yeah, right, when cows fly. Well, cows are flying because movements have gone to work on the press, and the press has come under pressure that it's not okay for them to simply ignore the reality of Palestinian life and Palestinian death at the hands of Israeli occupation forces. So all of that has been underway. Is it where it needs to be? Of course not. It's not even close. But if we look at the work, for example, of IMEU, the Institute for Middle East Understanding, they started just a few years after the U.S. campaign did. And when they started, it was one person desperately trying to figure out a strategy for challenging the U.S. press and its inherent, continual, constant pro-Israel bias. And now, they have a staff of, I think, 18 or 20 people scattered across the country. They can't keep up with their requests for information, for briefings, for background information, all of this. And as a result, not only of IMEU, but of the work of movements like all of you, movements like the U.S. campaign and so many others, has absolutely been transformed. If you remember, at the time of Operation Cast Lead, that was the first of these now sequential Israeli assaults on Gaza that have now culminated in a full-scale genocide. That one was started the day after Christmas of 2008 and went into the end of January the following year during the Obama administration. And during Cast Lead, one of the first things the Israelis did, and it was the first time they had done it, was to ban the press from Gaza, ban the international press. But they couldn't stop, and in fact there were front page pieces in the New York Times at that time, because there was a young woman stringer in Gaza, Takrid, what was her name, her last name? I'm so bad on names these days. I met her years later in Amsterdam, and we became good friends. But she was born and raised in Gaza. They couldn't get rid of her. She was there already. And she became not a stringer, but a full-time reporter for the New York Times with a byline on the front page almost every day for those 2 weeks. Because they had to rely on her, she was the only one. So we see this kind of distinction between their goals and what they can achieve. And now, with the combination of social media, when the brief moments come when there's electricity in Gaza, the first thing people do after hooking up the hospitals is to get a way of getting electricity to charge the phones and the computers to get the word out. And that means that we are all seeing it. That's what's been so different this time. Even in 2014, the last time that there was anything close to this level of absolute mindless assault, we never saw it like we're seeing it now. And without social media, that would not have been possible. And they can't stop it.
But our work is still cut out for us because,
absolutely.
I mean, even the liberal media is getting away with omissions and erasures and outright gaslighting, all the time. And
yes.
So many of us are trying to really establish a space for critical analysis as systematic erasure becomes the new normal. That's why I really feel that events like this one is so important.
It's absolutely right. The work on the press has to continue. I mean, I think, I always focus on how much it has changed, partly because it's true, but also because I don't think people want to come and join a movement that's been around for 35 years and hasn't been able to make any changes. We have made enormous changes, but the changes that need to be made is huge. It is a huge challenge, and some of it has to do with really old-fashioned kind of pressure on the old press, along with what we do with new versions of the press and social media and all that. We have to be writing letters to the editor, calling radio talk shows. They still have radio talk shows, and an awful lot of people in this country listen to them. So calling them, whatever the topic is, saying, this topic is very important, but isn't it also important that we be talking about how Israel is supporting the genocide in Gaza, and we're paying that, and that's why we don't have enough money to expand Medicare? There's a link here. Our near $1 trillion military budget, $1 trillion. Now they're asking for a full trillion for the year after, is a huge part of the reason that they can get away with saying, well, we don't have enough money for education and healthcare and jobs. We have enough money. We're just spending it on the wrong things. And we're letting the rich get away without paying taxes. That's the problem. The problem isn't that there is no money. There's plenty of money around. So this becomes very important, and the press is part of that. So using that, to write op-eds and submit them. They won't all be published, but then you publish it on social media after that. But if you can get it first in the mainstream press, you're also reaching a new audience. And then people start getting angry when they realize how they're being duped. What's being left out. Maybe somebody should start a column somewhere presumably in the alternative press that's called, what's not there today or something, about all the news that's not fit to print by the New York Times. The highlight of the slogan of the Washington Post these days is democracy dies in darkness. Yeah, and this is the Washington Post that just decided that their opinion pages could only feature op-eds that were about personal freedom and market economy. That's it. And they have some other articles, but they're not considered editorials. They need to be challenged on that. And the challenge includes, what are you not covering when you say you're only going to include praise for capitalism as acceptable on your editorial pages, right? So this kind of campaign needs to continue, and there are great campaigns going on, but it's going to take an enormous amount of work. One of the most important areas for that is student newspapers, which right now students are under such attack in this country. Students who are supporting Palestinian rights face a higher risk than we ever did. And that has to be taken into account. One of the ways that can be challenged is in the student newspapers.
Yeah, and I was going to mention also that last May 7th, here on the UMass campus, 137 peaceful protesters, students, faculty, and people from the community were arrested, zip-tied, and spent a night in jail.
Some of them in this room.
Yes, I was going to say, I am in awe of all the student protesters, the student movement on the nation's university campuses. I mean, it's just been incredible, incredible. Today, we heard that the feds revoked the visas of 5 UMass students. So Trump is really trying to manufacture as much fear and chaos as possible in order to intimidate us into submission. Their first political persecutions have all targeted individuals who were bold enough to believe that constitutional guarantees of free expression extended to solidarity with Palestine. Howard Zinn said once, our old friend, said, "You can't be neutral on a moving train." So we desperately need to derail that fast-moving train with everything we've got. And organizing is, as you said, is how we protect ourselves.
It's absolutely right.
So-
And I think what's key here is that the goal of these arrests, these frightening, sort of thuggish arrests that are taking place on the streets and in dorm rooms and in people's homes, is not only to make good on this campaign promise of massive numbers of immigrants being kicked out of the country, but to frighten people. It's exactly the goal. It's not a sideline. That's the reason. That's the reason that we're seeing the arrest and the threats of deportation of people with student visas and people with green cards, and talk about people with who are naturalized citizens, so that all people become afraid to raise this. And the reality is, this isn't just people believing that they should have the right of free expression. The First Amendment does, by law, apply to everyone in this country, not only citizens. The Harry Bridges case, I don't know if there are students of labor history here, but anybody who's studied labor history knows the name of Harry Bridges, who was the longtime head of the Longshore Workers Union, who they tried to deport allegedly for his support of or affiliation with, they couldn't prove he was a member because he wasn't, but he was allegedly affiliating with and associating with members of the Communist Party. And when it went all the way up to the Supreme Court found not only was he not able to be deported, but that everyone in this country had the right of free speech. The problem is, the right only exists when there are people to stand up and defend it. When a president can say, I don't really care what the law says, I'm going to do it anyway, that becomes the new law unless there's a challenge. And the good thing is, the good news is, there are challenges going on in the courts all over this country right now. Immigration lawyers are getting no sleep, but they are challenging each of these individually and the principles behind them. And at the lower levels of the court, so far, mostly, we're winning. Not all, but mostly. As they go up, it's going to get harder, and we're going to have losses. We're going to lose some, and there's the danger that the Supreme Court is going to make good on the threats they indicated today, what it looks like they're leaning to. They haven't made a final ruling yet on these issues, like the president can use this 200-year-old law that says that the president can deport anybody they want, essentially, in wartime, when it's not wartime. This is not wartime, except what the U.S. is doing to other countries around the world.
But
Nobody's waging war on
they're a
us.
threat to national security.
Oh, yeah, they're a threat to national security. Forgot about that, sorry. Yeah.
You talked a little bit about earlier about what we can do. Can you
Yeah.
say a few words about what effective organizing strategies that people can do in order to face such
Yeah.
horrific times that we are facing today?
Organizing is our answer to fascism. Organizing is our answer to genocide. The South African government made a great move against genocide by bringing this case to the International Court of Justice. Our job is to organize support for that case. Among other things, the U.S. right now is putting enormous pressure on South Africa, cutting all aid, ending crucial PEPFAR, the anti-AIDS medication that the U.S. is sending. 600,000 children around the world are likely, including in South Africa, to die of that. And so that's one little thing people can point to. But the key to the organizing is understanding that this is an attack on all of us.